This is Akashvani. We now bring you an interview with Dr. V.K.R.V Rao, one of the foremost economists of the day who has been made the National Professor recently. The interviewer is Sri K.N. Subramania, editor of Southern Economist.
Dr. Rao, I am grateful to you for sparing a bit of your precious time for this brief conversation. I am glad that you have been awarded the National Professorship. It's a great distinction. In the past, only a very few persons, great sons of India, were awarded this honor, or given this honor. If I may mention their names, they were Dr. Dooradarshan, Mr. Sunit Kumar Chatterjee, Mr. S.N. Bose, Professor T.M.R. Mahadevan, and Dr. K.S. Krishnan. And among the economists, if I may say so, you are the first to receive this national professorship. It's a honor which is very greatly overdue, and you have been playing a very important part on the national economic scene for the last half century. Actually, you have served variously as cabinet minister in the central government, first as Minister of Transport and Shipping, and then as the Minister of Education. You were also a member of the Planning Commission. You were Vice Chancellor of the Delhi University in the early 60s. You were also the founder director of 3 research institutes: Delhi School of Economics, Institute of Economic Growth, and Institute for Social and Economic Change. And you have also been awarded the Padma Vibhushan Award of the government in 1974, and you are honored with so many other awards also. Now, I hope you will be good enough to answer a few questions of mine about your distinguished service to the country.
Well, I don't like all this reading off of my, autobiographical data. It almost sounds like an obituary notice. In the list of names that you mentioned, you have omitted to mention one very, very distinguished name, a person whom I knew well and for whom I had great respect, as much respect as I had for Dr. Radhakrishnan. That is Dr. Sir C.V. Raman.
Sir C.V. Raman.
He was a national professor. Now, I'm sorry you mentioned all my, membership of the cabinet and so on. I don't think there is anything to do with this particular award. The letter that I received from the education minister mentioned my contribution to the country as an economist, not as a statesman, and not as a person who had a small, slight 4-year interlude in Indian politics. Now you can ask me any questions that you want to, and I shall be glad to answer them.
Dr. Rao, going back to your earlier years, what brought you to take up this dismal science? You could have as well shone well as a scientist or as an engineer or in any other field. What brought you to this economic subject, economic discipline?
Actually, an accident. I was studying in Wilson College and I was going to take up English literature for my honors. But then my favorite professor left the college. And since I had got a Wordsworth Scholarship and Prize, usually people who get that take economics, I took economics. But once I took economics, I was quite clear in my mind that what I wanted to do was to make use of economics for policy purposes. I knew that the problem of India was very largely economic, and if a man took up economics as a subject, it was not merely to teach or to make contributions to the theory of economics, but to make his knowledge of economics, after having studied it, useful from the point of view of dealing with the problems of the country. And all my life, I have really been an applied economist rather than a theoretical economist. I must tell you one thing also. My first book was published in 1931 on taxation of income in India. And the suggestions I made for the reform of the Indian income tax in that book in 1931, when I was hardly 23, many of those suggestions are now a part of the reformed income tax legislation of this country.
Dr. Rao, did your study abroad help you in any way, say, to get a grasp of the problems prevailing in India?
Well, if I had not gone abroad, I think I would have been a poor economist. I didn't go abroad to get any knowledge of Indian economic conditions, but I wanted a good grounding in economic theory and in economic logic. And that I was able to get in Cambridge, where I was a student of Keynes, a student of Pigou, a student of Kahn, a student of Joan Robinson, Austin Robinson. All the galaxy of economists were there in Cambridge between 32 and 34 when I was a student, and also when I did my PhD in 35-36. The thing about Cambridge, what sometimes I miss in my own universities in this country, not merely attending the lectures in economics, but the discussions we used to have, and the kind of almost midnight sessions we used to have, the good students amongst us, discussing not politics, not films, not film stars, but discussing problems in economic theory and economic logic. And I owe a great deal to Cambridge for whatever little contribution I've been able to make to the discussion of Indian economic problems.
That was pre-independence period. Dr. Rao, do you think that the economists in Britain were keenly aware of the problems facing the country at that time?
Well, it was not their business to do so. They were concerned with British economics. In fact, during my Cambridge days, I studied about the problems of British labour, British industry, British money, British public finance, and so on, just as we in India study problems of Indian economics. But in addition to that, the theoretical training that they give was far superior to the training we used to get in our country. And that is one of the major reasons why I started the Delhi School of Economics. I made up my mind that there should be in the world an DSE, which will take rank with the LSE. And I'm glad to say that today the Delhi School of Economics is an internationally known institution, and the best teaching in economic theory is given in the Delhi School of Economics.
There is no doubt about that. And about these three institutions which you have started, and I mean, it is a great contribution to the learning of economics in India. And see, what were the hurdles that you faced while starting these institutions? First, let us take up this Delhi School of Economics.
I must tell you, I mean, I had lots of problems when I started the Delhi School of Economics. If I were to talk about how it came into existence, it will exhaust all the 10 or 12 minutes that we have. But I tell you why it was brought into existence. A few months before I returned back to the service of Delhi University, I was in an Indian delegation when my services were temporarily with the Government of India, Ministry of External Affairs. And we were discussing the world food problems. I had put forward the suggestion that there should be a dual pricing system, that there should be normal imports at commercial prices and concessional imports at low prices for the benefit of vulnerable groups through government-to-government channels. And the leader of my delegation thought this was charity. He didn't like it. He said, economists are there not for participating in decision making but to produce arguments. And I replied to him that economists are not lawyers and they don't argue to briefs. And there and then I made up my mind I shall immediately return to the University of Delhi and start an institution where there will be independent and objective training and research in economics. Because it is my belief, Subramaniam, my belief, that an independent country needs far more the services of independent economists than a colonial country. In a colonial country, everybody knows the government is doing wrong. The people are not with them. In an independent country, the people are with the party in power. Yes. And they also make mistakes. Therefore, it's much more important for an independent country to have objective economists than for a colonial country.
What led to the spawning of the two other institutions which are equally distinguished?
Well, the second institution was a mistake. Like you are taking to family planning and suddenly finding that your wife is pregnant. I had no specific intention of starting the Institute of Economic Growth. But the Delhi School of Economics, which is an autonomous institution, was running into a big deficit. And the UGC said, if you become a part of the university, we will give you all the money that you want and much more than you require. But not if you are autonomous and independent. I tried to get some money from outside. I got a big grant from the Ford Foundation of $300,000. But they said you can't use it for maintenance purposes. You can use it for research, but not for maintenance. My colleagues in the Delhi School of Economics preferred the security of the university to the troubles of collecting money for keeping it going. So I handed over the Delhi School of Economics back to the University of Delhi. And then with the money that I had, I thought I would start another institute called the Institute of Economic Growth. Then, of course, I got money from other sources. But the Institute of Economic Growth has been doing excellent work. It doesn't do much teaching. Mainly it's concerned with research problems. And the biggest achievement it had, which I can tell you, was in 1974, when a group of the economists of the Economic Growth Institute, under my leadership, brought out a program for anti-inflation, which was accepted by the cabinet and by the government of India, and which was largely responsible for bringing down the inflation rate practically to 0 point in 1975.
Dr. Rao, nearer home you started such a good institute, see where none existed before. What were the compelling compulsions behind this?
Well, I'm afraid this was partly a sentimental and parochial reason. I had spent 30 years in Delhi in the north. I am a Kannada man. My mother's people all come from this particular state, and my culture and my roots are in this soil. I thought I had done nothing for the south, and the south to me meant Karnataka and Bangalore, a place I had been coming to as a small boy of 10 and more. So I decided I must have an institution in the south, an institution of excellence for teaching and research, and that's how the institute came into existence. I got complete support from everybody in Bangalore. V.K.R. Rao was then the development commissioner, V.K.R.V Rao was a governor, who was under governor's rule, then came Dooradarshan, and every secretary in the government of Karnataka, every chief minister, every governor has been full of support for the Institute for Social and Economic Change. And I think I can say with some pride, though it's a very recent institution, and my youngest child, it has already made its mark both in the national and international world.
Going back to the late 30s and early 40s, you were a great admirer of Nehru. And see you, if I am not mistaken, you were among the group of young people who started the socialist movement within the Congress. Can you tell us something about those days in a very brief format?
Well, I've been a social democrat all my life, from my college days. And we were a small group in Bombay, led by Yusuf Merali, who is no longer alive. And of course, I was with Jawaharlal Nehru. He was very fond of me. I met him many, many times. And I always remember him with great affection and pride. But you know, in hindsight, I'm still a social democrat. I'm beginning to have doubts in my mind, not about my belief in social democracy, but I have now come to the conclusion that unless the psychological foundations are laid for making people believe that the public sector is more important than the private sector, that public money is more important than private money, and that honesty is much more required in public affairs than in private affairs, unless that psychology is created, I'm afraid any number of institutional and legislative changes are bringing about socialism will fail, as they have failed in this country.
That's the conclusion actually you drew in your latest book on socialism. Yes,
that's right.
I read that.
But I have not given up my hope yet, because I think it is possible. It is possible with proper use of the media, and today our people can be exposed to the media in a very large kind of way. Not only the newspapers, the radio, which covers millions of listeners, now the TV, which is going to cover millions and millions of viewers. I think we should make use of our communication capacity to bring about a radical change in the value system in this country, and to make people believe that if we want an egalitarian and a socialistic society, we can't function as we function in a capitalist society.
Dr. Rao, your name is always associated in the academic field with the national income studies. You have brought out a excellent seminal work on the subject only recently, last year I hope. Can you tell us something about your conclusions on the national income trends? I mean, because that's very important for the economy of the country. See?
I'll tell you two things. First of all, how I came into the national income field. When I took up the subject, I was told by Dr. Boli that it would be foolish on my part to work on this subject because there is no data available. That was a challenge to me. I went ahead. I was a one-man commission. I toured the whole length and breadth of India collecting material on meat consumption, milk consumption, mortality of cattle, all sorts of things. Salaries of municipal servants, salaries of industrial workers, sending out circulars. So I got fantastic response. And I had the pride and privilege of getting Professor Boli not only to award me the PhD degree, he was my examiner, he also wrote the foreword to my book, which was published in 1940. In 1983, I came back to the same subject and dealt with what you are talking about, the trends in the growth of national income between 1950 and 1980.
The changes.
What has happened? National income has grown, but nothing like what it should have grown if we had been wiser in our handling of economic affairs. Partly, of course, the growth of population came in our way, but partly also, we are what we call Kannadalli Arambasura. We start many things. We don't believe in maintaining what we have, in getting the best capacity, utilization of capacity that we have created. All the time we are going in for new things and more new things. It is important. We must have more investment. Without more investment, this country can't grow. But we have neglected utilization of capacity. We have neglected maintenance of what we have created, as you can see from the power breakdowns and the telephone breakdowns and the water supply breakdowns and so on, which never happens in any other industrial or civilized country in the world. So maintenance, utilization of capacity, new investment of course, but new investment should not dominate the Indian planning program. And another thing that I have noticed, which I referred to in my book, we have neglected the human capital formation in this country. Our biggest resource are our labor force, are our human beings. Their education, their health, their conduct, the building of their character, the building of their creative capacities, the stimulation in them of the spirit of enterprise and risk-taking and so on. We have neglected that. I think the biggest failure that we have achieved in the 35 years of planning in this country, which has very large economic implications, is in human capital formation and in the educational system, which is totally irrelevant to the needs of the country and does not play the part it should play in bringing about economic development, excepting it has given us an export industry. We export intelligent Indians abroad and now we are living on the remittances.
Dr. Rao, one last question. What is your assessment of the contribution of Indian economists to the policy making?
Well, I must say, I don't know what the position is in recent times, but in the times during the period when I was functioning actively, I would say even in the British period and afterwards in the 50s and the 60s, the government always paid attention to what the economists were saying. And I'm glad that after a long interregnum, again the government has started paying attention to what the economists are saying. I think the Indian economists have had their impact on Indian policy. But unfortunately or fortunately, and I'm one of the guilty parties, the Indian economists as a class by and large have been socialistically inclined, have been idealistic, and have not been as pragmatic and practical and technical as they should have been. Now that is being corrected.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Rao. Thank you for the illuminating interview. We are very grateful to you.
Thank you very much.
You were listening to an interview with Dr. V.K.R.V Rao, the National Professor. The interviewer was Sri K.N. Subramania, editor of Southern Economist. This broadcast came to you from Akashvani, Bangalore. This is All India Radio, Bangalore and Bhadravati. The Indian Constitution and Social Change. Here is Dr. V.K.R.V Rao to speak on this subject.
When India fought for freedom under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, it was not merely for the purpose of recovering national sovereignty. It was also for the purpose of establishing a new society in India that would give the people power over their government, bring about a radical improvement in the level of living of the masses in terms not only of economic change but also social change and cultural richness, reduce disparities in income, wealth and concentration of economic power, and equalize opportunities. Gandhiji called it Ram Rajya, Jawaharlal called it socialism, and Vinoba called it Sarvodaya. There were of course differences in detail in these expressions, but they all involved social change and a better deal for the common man. When therefore the founding fathers of our constitution met in the Constituent Assembly to draw up a written constitution for the country, they decided to embody in the constitution itself the picture of the society they wanted to create in the country, so that it would not only serve as a guideline to the central and state governments that followed after independence, but also function as a solemn undertaking with the people. Thus, Article 38 of the Constitution has imposed on government the obligation that, I quote, "The state shall strive to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting as effectively as it may a social order in which justice, social, economic and political, shall inform all the institutions of the national life." Unquote. The task assigned, therefore, is the creation of a new social order. The accent is on social justice, and coverage extends to all institutions of the country, economic, social and political, and at all levels, central, state, and local. This implies a massive era of social change with primary responsibility for its implementation being placed on the state. Justice is overall expression used to pinpoint the major element constituting the change. And justice means equity. And equity finds expression in equal opportunity for all citizens in all aspects of human activity. On the political side, it means democracy and the rule of law. On the economic side, it means a minimum standard of living for all people, a steep reduction in disparities in income and wealth, and an equal opportunity for all citizens to rise in the economic ladder that is permitted to exist. On the social side, it means equal respect for the dignity of all human beings in the country and the complete abolition of all types of social discrimination that involve an erosion of individual human dignity. The Constitution provides for the realization of this desired social order by guaranteeing to all citizens certain fundamental rights enforceable by the courts and certain directive principles of state policy which shall be the duty of the state to apply in making laws for the country. The implementing machinery will be the central and state governments, whose structure, accountability, functions, and mutual relations are also all spelt out in the Constitution. The directive principles of state policy, which are embodied in Articles 36 to 51 of the Constitution and constitute Part 4 of the document, spell out certain important ingredients of the new social order. Among these, the following deserve special mention as embodying the major thrust towards social change that has been envisaged after independence. 1. Equal rights to all citizens to an adequate means of livelihood. 2. Ownership and control of all material resources to be so distributed as to subserve the common good. 3. Prevention of concentration of wealth and means of production such as will lead to the common detriment. 4. Panchayati Raj and local self-government. 5. Right to work, education and public assistance for the economically handicapped. 6. Securing to all workers a living wage, decent conditions of work, and full enjoyment of leisure and social and cultural opportunities. 7. Free and compulsory education for all children up to the age of 14 years. And 8. Special promotion of the educational and economic interests of the weaker sections, especially the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and protecting them from social injustice and all forms of exploitation. The directive principles constitute the charter of social change and of the new society for the masses of our people. While the rights accruing to the people from these principles are not enforceable by law, those embodied in Chapter 3 on Fundamental Rights are enforceable by law and cover civil liberty and equality before the law. And they have not only political implications but also social, cultural, and economic implications. Altogether, therefore, the Indian Constitution is not just an instrument setting out the structure of government and the political rights of the people. It is an expression of the people's will for the creation of a new society. The preamble, which contains, so to speak, the soul of the Constitution and governs all its provisions, proclaims this in ringing language. I quote, "We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign democratic republic and to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic, and political, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, equality of status and opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity of the nation. In our Constituent Assembly, this 26th day of November 1949, do hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this Constitution. Unquote. What the people have promised themselves was not available to them when they enacted this Constitution. Fulfillment of the promise meant change, and change of vast dimensions, affecting all people and in all aspects of life. Social change is thus the keynote of the Indian Constitution. In the light of what I have said, there is obviously no need to change the Constitution for bringing about social change or ushering in a new social order. All that is required is implementation. The position, however, is not so simple. The fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution are not necessarily consistent with the implementation of the directive principles of state policy. And the question has risen as to which of these two chapters of the Constitution, namely Chapter 3 or Chapter 4, has the overriding influence. As far as a strict and purely formal interpretation is concerned, it is possible to hold that the directive principles do not have a justiciable character and that therefore their implementation is restricted by the rights guaranteed to the citizen under Chapter 3. This, however, would be to take a wholly unrealistic view of the main objective of the Indian Constitution and of the forces of social change which are operating in the country. The fact that the very preamble of the Constitution, which I have quoted, sets out the basic objectives of the Constitution, which obviously govern all the provisions that follow, including chapters 3 and 4, would bear out my contention. Nor must we forget that while the preamble makes no mention of property, it does mention specifically justice and equality besides liberty. Property is a right created by society, and the exercise of property rights has to conform to the implementation of social justice and equality of status and opportunity for all citizens. Under the circumstances, any formal or strictly juristic conflict between fundamental rights, and especially the right to property, and the directive principles has to be resolved in favor of the latter. This is especially so for the directive principles embodied in subclause B and C specifically require property rights to be so exercised as not to result in concentration of wealth and means of production to the common detriment, and so distributed as best to subserve the common good. The exercise of property rights, especially in the means of production, is thus conditioned by the social objective, and it is a social objective for the securing of which the people have given themselves this Constitution. When, moreover, the people, functioning through their elected representatives in Parliament and by an overwhelming majority, declare themselves in favor of legislative action for securing the social objective, I cannot understand how they can be denied the exercise of this right, which in fact was the very essence of the principles underlying the Constitution. I may understand the relevance of objections based on practical economic grounds of the impact on production and growth without which social justice cannot become a reality. But this is a matter for legislative debate and legislative finding, and not a matter of juristic interpretation of the Constitution. This is a justification for the recent amendments to the Constitution, which are sought to give teeth to some of the clauses of the directive principles. In my view, what has been done by Parliament in its recent amendments to the Constitution is no more than what had become necessary to ease the process of social change and bring nearer the achievement of the new social order promised by the people to themselves in the preamble to the Constitution. The Indian Constitution is basically an instrument for social change in a peaceful and constitutional manner without incurring the social loss and instability that violent revolutions involve. And it is but proper that we use the Constitution for the purpose of promoting social change and bringing about the new social order which the people desired in principle when they enacted the Constitution and now desire to see implemented to the extent and in the manner in which they think it is immediately desirable to do so.
You were listening to Dr. V.K.R.V Rao on the Indian Constitution and social change. This broadcast came to you from All India Radio, Bangalore and Bhadravati.